If you have questions about where Canada's oil sands industry stands on climate change, you're not alone. It's time to clear the air. Oil sands contribute significant carbon emissions in Canada. So the 6 largest companies have joined forces on carbon capture technology that will reduce emissions by millions of tons annually. It's a key step in helping Canada meet its net zero climate goal. Come see what we're doing at pathwaysalliance.ca.
I'm sure many of you will recognize this ad. It is the central advertisement of Pathways Alliance, a coalition of 6 of the largest oil sands companies. Their stated mission is to bring Alberta's oil sands in line with Canada's environmental commitments, including net zero emissions by 2050. The ad appears harmless on the surface, but upon closer inspection, it poses a problem. How can an industry that relies on fossil fuels have net zero emissions? Can we trust what they're saying? Or is this another example of corporate greenwashing? Greenwashing involves making deceitful claims that mask environmentally harmful practices by drawing attention to promises of sustainability. Common examples of greenwashing include natural imagery, excessive advertising for sustainable changes, and making ambitious promises without actual change. Knowing this, let's re-examine the ad put out by Pathways Alliance. Notice how they depict the oil sands, lush and green, in stark contrast with the vast tailings ponds and open pits that result from oil sands extraction. The credibility of Pathways Alliance seems shaky at best, but to know for sure requires going deeper. Firstly, many view the claims of sustainability from the oil sands industry with skepticism. Case in point, Canada's Competition Bureau has launched an investigation into the marketing practices of the Pathways Alliance, following accusations of greenwashing by Greenpeace Canada. Additionally, Canada faced criticism at the UN Climate Change Conference for its ongoing expansion of oil and gas, as it is necessary to reduce the oil and gas industry to meet climate commitments. However, Pathways Alliance opposes this. Vice President Mark Cameron says he supports the federal government's efforts to make significant emissions reductions by 2030 and its goal of net zero by 2050, but added, getting there requires a practical and realistic approach to emissions reduction to protect jobs and investment. But just how practical and realistic is Pathways Alliance's plan to reduce emissions? The oil sands industry is one of the most environmentally inefficient crude oil projects in the world. The Carnegie Endowment's Oil Climate Index suggests oil sands extraction releases 2.2 times the emissions per barrel as conventional oil. Despite claims of reduced emissions, overall emissions intensity has risen by 9% since the 2000s. Furthermore, the oil sands have a long history of environmental destruction. For instance, oil sands production has impacted over 940 square kilometers of boreal forest, an area the size of San Antonio, Texas. Of this, 60 square kilometers have been permanently restored, and a mere 1 square kilometer given back to the province. Additionally, tailings ponds created by oil sands extraction hold 1.5 trillion liters of unusable water. That's twice the amount of water used annually in the entire country of Ireland. Regardless, oil sands companies continue to create more tailings. What's more, Alberta's caribou face severe threats due to oil sands extraction. Their population has declined 80% since 2000 as a result of habitat disruption. This is namely due to seismic lines, which segregate vast swaths of forest and act as highways for predators. Furthermore, Canada's oil industry has seen continued growth every year despite environmental concerns, and Canada's energy regulator predicts that oil sands production will increase well into the 2030s. Finally, there's the crux of Pathways Alliance. Carbon capture and storage is heavily relied upon in their plan to achieve net zero, but is not without its flaws. Investment in carbon capture and storage is risky, with under 40% of facilities ever becoming operational. Additionally, it diverts funds from immediate and effective strategies, with less than 1% of funds going to clean energy. In addition, it takes 330 to 420 kilowatt hours to capture 1 ton of CO2. That's the equivalent of charging 4 electric cars. Due to being off-grid, these facilities are commonly run on natural gas and thus generate their own emissions, reducing their effective emissions reduction. Overall, the plan to reduce emissions is anything but practical and realistic. Even if none of the issues discussed were a factor, their plan would still fail to meaningfully reduce emissions. 70% of carbon from carbon capture is used to extract more oil by pumping CO2 into old oil wells. In fact, Pathways Alliance's plan does not even account for the emissions of the fossil fuels sold. Thus, even if implemented, it only stands to reduce the total life cycle emission of each barrel from 770 kilograms to 550 kilograms. Definitely not nothing, but certainly not net zero. Pathways Alliance is a case study for how greenwashing works to slow, meaningful environmental action. It's clear something needs to be done. The first step in addressing greenwashing is understanding. Educate yourself and on others on proper environmental practice. Question elaborate promises and pressure governments to enforce restrictions on greenwashing. Furthermore, corporate attempts to offset emissions as opposed to reducing emissions lack integrity and fail at addressing the urgency of climate change. According to a UN panel led by Catherine McKenna, governments must add regulatory weight behind corporate environmental pledges and end investments into oil and gas if we wish to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Despite the lies put forward by Pathways Alliance, the truth is clear. If Alberta's oil sands continue to grow, so will emissions. If Canada wants to meet climate targets, the oil sands must see drastic reduction. To quote McKenna, the planet cannot afford delays, excuses, or more greenwashing.